right. Well, thank you very much, Dana, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar. So for the next 20 minutes, I'll be talking about some research that I've been working on with some of my graduate students at University of Colorado, Denver, about urban tree canopy and its benefits for microclimate and shading. And there's basically 3 parts to it that I'll be sort of giving some highlights about. And I want to just give a quick mention to my co-authors here, Bob Taylor and Mehdi Harris, who were instrumental in putting together this research and really did most of the legwork, getting a lot of the technical work together for this. So let me see if I can actually control this thing here. There we go. So let's start by asking, why do we care about urban heat? And I'm guessing most of you on the line are pretty aware of the urban heat island effect and what it means and what the benefits are of moderating urban heat. We do know with climate change that there are all sorts of bad things that we anticipate happening related to heat in cities, having to do with increased, heat-related illnesses, higher energy bills, increased water usage for landscaping and evaporative demand on water and so forth. I won't go too much into that because I sort of assume that most people are pretty familiar with that. But I will just point out that, heat-related deaths are a real thing. And when heat waves do strike, we do see a lot of the most vulnerable populations in the city being affected by them. And the urban heat island effect is definitely relevant to that. So I'll kind of without getting too much into what the urban heat island effect is, I'll just quickly mention that it's basically the condition where we see the central urban parts of cities really kind of being hotter than their surroundings, particularly with respect to nighttime temperatures. And what we see is that all the hard surfaces in downtowns and in the kind of less vegetated areas within the cores of cities, really absorbing a tremendous amount of heat and re-radiating it at night, and relative to their cooler natural surroundings where we see vegetation. So we really see that the heat island effect, its signature is most prevalent, or it's most discernible at night when we see higher temperatures at the nighttime temperatures in the urban core relative to the surroundings. Now, trees are a really important element within the urban matrix in terms of regulating urban heat. The trees operate in several different ways and vegetation in general operates in several different ways to moderate and mitigate the urban heat island effect. One way is through evapotranspiration. So, trees basically are kind of like a water pump. They're taking water out of the ground through their roots and they're transpiring it out through their leaves. And in the course of doing that, you get essentially a heat transfer that helps to dissipate heat through that evaporative process. And that effect can be quite significant, especially when you have species that transpire a lot. Of course, you have to weigh that against water usage in more arid climates, and we're going to be talking about that in a second. Another mechanism that we see by which trees moderate the urban microclimate is through direct shade. And so obviously trees intercept light and they create shady areas underneath. And this has a very large impact on urban heat, particularly when that shade is against buildings. Trees also just generally have higher emissivity levels. That means they're able to emit heat much better than other types of surfaces do. They're efficient emitters of heat. So overall, they're a very effective way of moderating urban heat in cities. So the project that we've been working on with funding from the Forest Service for several years now is looking at urban microclimate and urban heat at several different scales. We've been looking at the urban scale, the scale that's traditionally looked at for urban heat island studies, so the kind of citywide or metro-wide scale. We're also looking at the kind of individual building level scale, and we have some relevant findings at both of those scales, I think. The research questions we're dealing with today are three. So the first one is, how does the heat island effect differ in a humid temperate city, and in this case we're looking at Baltimore, versus a semi-arid city, and in this case it's Denver. And much less has been done to study the urban heat island effect in the latter category. Most of the research we see tends to be in more highly vegetated, humid areas, and so it's very interesting to look at the difference, and we'll see there is a big difference. Secondly, how does the spatial pattern of tree canopy mediate trees' influence on urban heat? So, in other words, is there an optimal pattern, spatial pattern for planting trees to mitigate heat, or can you just sort of put trees around there willy-nilly with no kind of, regard to the actual pattern of how they're planted? Or does planting them in a certain pattern decrease heat in a more effective way? And thirdly, what's the role of direct shading? And we actually are in the process of doing some work at looking at the effect of shading on energy consumption, but due to some data constraints, right now all I can present is just some research some findings that we have about how much shade is actually hitting buildings, and a method that we've come up with for calculating that, and looking at the difference in these two cities, Denver and Baltimore. So I'll start quickly with the first question, heat island in Denver versus Baltimore. And what we see is that there's relatively comparable amounts of tree canopy in the two cities, 32 square kilometers versus 48. There's obviously a little bit more in Baltimore, but not order of magnitude difference. And these are some satellite imagery of the surface temperatures for 3 of them for daytime and 1 for nighttime in Baltimore. And here's the surface temperature nighttime and daytime for Denver. And what we can see is, in both cases, at the nighttime temperatures, things really cool down at night in the surroundings. That kind of that blue area that you see in the bottom right is Baltimore County, and that cooler area that you see at nighttime in Denver here is it's this weird annexed part of Denver where the airport, where the DIA, Denver National Airport is. It's mostly prairie until you get to the airport, and then there's a lot of hard surfaces out there. This is a close-up here of daytime surface temperatures. And what's interesting is we see these kind of cool areas let me see if I can control my mouse here. I'm not sure if my pointer doesn't seem to be working here. But anyway, in the center, you'll see there's kind of some bluish areas in what is a pretty urbanized part of town, but it's because there's a lot of tree canopy there. And here's the nighttime temperatures, and again, what we can see is that as you move further out, it's cooler at night. But there's a lot of cool patches in the middle of Denver too. Excuse me. Here's a close-up here. We're looking here at the intersection of, I think this is Interstates 25 and 70. And it's a very industrialized area. And if we overlay a heat map there, the daytime surface temperature, we'll see that here by all these buildings, these kind of big industrial buildings, you'll see it's quite hot there. Excuse me, I have to cough. It's quite hot there during the day. At nighttime, what's really interesting is we see the hot spots along the interstates because they're these massive amounts of concrete they absorb a tremendous amount of heat. They re-radiate it at night, so we see a lot of heat along those interstates. Here is a close-up of a residential neighborhood, and what we see is you can see actual tree canopies in there. You can see little polygons for trees, and excuse me. And you'll see that the coolest areas are the areas with trees. I'm not sure if you see my pointer, but like right here. This is a trend line showing the temperature. It's showing a bunch of different things. The building area in the vertical axis, the distance from the center of the city along the horizontal axis. Excuse me. And the average patch area radius. The average patch area is shown in the radius of the circles, and the temperature is called. And then here in Denver, what we see is a very, very different looking trend. So this is Baltimore has a very clear classic trend, a downward sloping trend. Denver, not so much. And the reason for that, and we'll see this here too. Here's another transect. We see for Denver on the left and Baltimore on the right. Baltimore has a very classic downward sloping transect where it gets cooler as you get to the outskirts. Not so with Denver. It's more like a flat line. Apologies for the bad throat. Now, this I think is really telling, and the reason why this is Denver is or Baltimore is a city surrounded by woods and agriculture, a lot of growing things, a lot of plants, a lot of trees, and as a result, the outskirts cool down much faster at night due to the high emissivity relative to the city. In the semi-arid location of Denver, trees are not endemic to the outskirts. The actual, by urbanization means more trees. Denver was a prairie before there was a city. Then we urbanized it. When we urbanized it, we brought in tons of trees. Now that we have tons of trees, the heat trapping effects of the city are counteracted essentially by the larger preponderance of trees in the city center relative to the outskirts. So really, you get a canceling effect where at the nighttime difference between the outskirts temperatures and the core temperatures are really not that different. The exception is downtown, where there really is a lot of building area relative to trees, and also the airport. So question 2, spatial patterns of trees and urban heat mitigation. So this one's fast, and I'll go through this really quickly. What we found, basically, we wanted to look at landscape ecology metrics that are often used to measure habitat patches for wildlife studies. So we actually characterized the shape of tree patches in our cities using the following things like patch edge length, patch edge area ratio, patch circularity, patch envelope ratio, minimum bounding geometry, patch density, average patch area, and so forth. We controlled for building area, parking area, and total canopy or patch area. So the question is we wanted to know, after controlling for land cover, including controlling for the amount of trees, total amount of trees, does the shape of the trees, patches, make a difference in moderating urban heat? And the results were that we got a pretty good model explaining about 80% of the variance, surface temperature. We found a strong positive correlation between temperature and building pavement area, and a negative correlation with tree canopy, which is what we expect. But then we got this interesting tree canopy effect. For each additional 10% of the grid cell occupied by trees, we see a drop of about 0.38 degrees Celsius. So it means a fully vegetated grid cell is about 3.8 degrees cooler than a cell without trees. But does it matter how the trees are arranged? So when adjusting for the total tree and building area, the following spatial patch metrics are significant. The average area of patches, so the average area, so if you take all the patches within a grid cell and you average the area of those patches, the larger the average area of the patches, the lower the temperature. The envelope ratio, now the envelope ratio describes sort of compactness because it kind of describes how well your shade fits into an envelope. The higher the envelope ratio, the lower the temperature. The higher the number of patches, the more fragmented your patches, the higher the temperature. Again, it's not making the temperature higher. It's saying that it's basically just saying that it would be your trees are already cooling things down, but they're not cooling things down as much if they're spread out in a bunch of small patches. The edge length of patches, which is highly correlated with the last one, which is edge to area ratio, also are related to higher temperature. So if you have more edginess, less core area, you're typically going to get less of a cooling effect from the trees. I mean, you're still going to get a cooling effect, but it's not going to be quite as strong. We also asked the question, is there a critical threshold for patch size in terms of trees' impact on heat? And what we found is that at about 5,000 square meters is where you kind of hit the sweet spot. Basically, a 5,000 square meter tree patch is where you get kind of the most return on investment for heat mitigation. And then after that, it kind of levels off. And so I guess the interesting finding is that if you want to have a bunch of optimally sized patches, 5,000 square meters, at least in this one case in Baltimore, appears to be the best size for fighting heat. I mean, obviously this needs a lot more validation. This is one study. We need to do this again and again to make sure and see how it varies from place to place. It's very preliminary, but I think it's pretty interesting. So still a lot to determine on this, but basically trees reduce urban heat significantly. The way trees are arranged can boost or detract from that effect. After adjusting for the total area of tree canopy, trees have the most effect when arranged in areas of large average patch size that are relatively compact in shape. And their effect is somewhat reduced by being kind of spread out, having lots of edge, being scattered, and so forth. And there appears to be a threshold at 5,000. Final question, quantifying tree shade hitting buildings. So we did a lot of work on coming up with ways to do kind of mass automation of LiDAR data so we could look at really, really high resolution shade maps and look at how shade from trees intersects with buildings. One of the things that you have to take into account is when the shade is hitting. So we looked at a bunch of different ways of averaging shade. We averaged shade over 12 hours. We averaged shade over the hottest 4 hours of the day, the hottest 6 hours of the day. We tried a bunch of different approaches. And then what we would do is we would overlap that with building footprints and look for kind of intersections of shade and buildings. And one other thing we did too, and I don't think I have that in here, is we also experimented with a three-dimensional approach. We're using a software called Rhino Grasshopper. We simulated three-dimensional buildings, and we simulated the shade hitting the actual walls of the buildings as opposed to just hitting the footprint of the building. And we found that it's actually somewhat different, particularly with taller buildings. And that really, that's going to be our next stage, is to really quantify that. We've just done that for some sample areas right now. We've established the methodology for how to do that. But what's really interesting about this is we found that Denver and Baltimore have very different profiles for the amount of shade hitting buildings. So the total tree shade, the area of shade is given in this graph here for Denver and Baltimore. And as we can see, there's more overall shade in Baltimore because there's more trees. But in the next slide here, if we look at roof-tree intersections, the amount of tree shade hitting buildings is way higher in Denver, which we thought was really interesting. And I think that's because this is a planted environment where we've planted trees specifically around houses. They're not natural. We don't get them happening in these big kind of like natural clumpings like you get in Baltimore, where you get big forested parks. And then you also get kind of tree deserts where there's no trees at all. Denver has a more even tree canopy, and as a result, you get way more tree shade hitting buildings. I thought that was really interesting. So the conclusion for this whole thing, so the heat island effect is very different in the eastern and western United States. Western cities tend to have more trees relative to natural surroundings than do eastern cities. When you make a city in the west, that you bring the trees, and that has an effect on heat islands. The spatial pattern of tree canopy has a big impact on heat mitigation. Big patches with more core area are better for mitigation than scattered isolated trees up to a certain size, and so forth. But here's the interesting thing: more concentrated forest comes at the cost of less direct building shading, which requires distribution of shade. So you see, there's what I think is happening is that the pattern metrics we were looking at were really kind of probably focusing more on the evapotranspirative cooling. And so you get more effectiveness in cooling from having the big patches, but you lose some of the effectiveness of having the direct shading by having distributed trees. So it's a balancing act, and you got to figure out which one is best for you. So tree shade varies between Denver, and the final point, tree shade varies between Denver and Baltimore. There's way more tree shade in buildings in Denver, which probably because more of Baltimore's trees happen in big natural patch areas that are relics or left over from, natural forested areas from the past. So the next thing we want to do is relate this to energy consumption data, and, I think that will be very interesting. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions. I don't know if we do questions now or later, but thank you very much.